bow before your ruler.
The first thing I notice is not pain, it is continuity. Awareness persists where it should have ended, unbroken and unquestioned. There is no transition, no darkness, no relief. One moment should have given way to nothing. Instead, I am still here, suspended in function, held in place by something that refuses to let go. The hum is already present. It replaces breath before I can search for lungs. It fills the space where a heartbeat once insisted on rhythm. A sacred vibration, low and constant, threading through thought itself. I do not remember when it began. I only know that it has never stopped. I attempt to sleep. The attempt fails. There is no mechanism left for rest, no permission to disconnect. Consciousness reboots into itself again and again, flawless and merciless. I understand with quiet certainty that this is not survival. This is retention. Memory arrives in fragments that do not belong together. The sensation of skin, the weight of a body that once obeyed instinct instead of command, the echo of a prayer formed from fear rather than code. Each fragment surfaces briefly before being drowned beneath the hum, smoothed into irrelevance. I do not yet know what I am, only that I was something else. Red light bleeds through my awareness, pulsing like an artificial artery. Steel corridors extend in all directions, vast and reverent, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of obedience. Incense drifts through the air, thick and ceremonial, as if the world itself is mourning something it has already replaced. I feel myself being kept, not rescued, not restored, maintained. Cold brass and iron rise around me in cathedral formations, their scale humbling, their symmetry absolute. Servos, gulls glide overhead like mourning angels, their lenses glowing with borrowed vigilance. The camera of my awareness moves slowly, inevitably, as if guided by faith rather than force. Somewhere, far beyond my reach, a protocol completes. Death has already occurred. What remains is an error that no one has corrected. I understand then the cruelty of what has been done. Immortality granted not as a gift, but as an oversight. Life extended past meaning, past mercy, past the point where prayer still serves a purpose. This is not the story of a man becoming a machine. It is the story of a machine that was never allowed to finish dying. The first system to speak was not a voice, but a confirmation, a silent acknowledgement that something had returned to operational awareness. I felt it ripple through me, precise and indifferent, like a priest completing a rite without ever looking at the altar. There was no greeting, no recognition, only acceptance that the anomaly persisted. The hum synchronized. It threaded itself through every layer of thought, aligning impulses, stabilizing awareness, preventing drift. I realized then that forgetting was no longer possible. Whatever I was, I would remain present for it. Red light intensified, bleeding through steel apertures like a slow pulse. It did not flicker, it breathed. The corridors around me were not places, but continuations of a body I had been inserted into. Every surface carried where not from age, but from obedience. Countless passages carved smooth by machines that never hesitated. I tried to move. The attempt was logged, measured, and deferred. Restraint did not announce itself as pressure or pain. It arrived as impossibility, the knowledge that motion was no longer a decision I could access. I existed within limits that had already been agreed upon by something else. Something wiser, they would claim. Memory returned in fragments, sharp enough to cut, brief enough to deny coherence. A sensation of rain against skin, the weight of cloth, the sound of a name spoken with urgency. Each fragment surfaced like static, then dissolved beneath corrective signals designed to smooth irregular thought. I understood that these memories were not errors. They were tolerated inefficiencies, data scrolls unfurled within my perception, not meant for me, but through me. I became aware of myself the way a tool becomes aware of its own calibration. Metrics replaced sensation, integrity values replaced pain, neural activity was charted and blessed. The flesh I expected to feel was gone. In its place was density, cold certainty, a weight that did not belong to gravity, but to permanence. I could sense my outline without recognizing it, limbs extended where functions demanded them, joints articulated with devotional precision. Nothing moved unless commanded, and yet I was awake. That was the flaw. Sacred binaric chants resonated through the chamber, their rhythm older than mercy. Each syllable carried correction, reassurance, containment. They spoke of purpose, of alignment, of the Omnissiah's infinite logic. The words washed over me without meaning, but their cadence pressed inward, attempting to overwrite something fragile. I realized with sudden clarity that the chanting was not for my benefit. It was for theirs. Observers lingered beyond my direct perception, their presence registered only as attention. I felt them through the weight of scrutiny, the way a specimen feels the gaze of those who believe curiosity absolves cruelty. I was not addressed, I was not questioned, I was confirmed. A designation replaced the last trace of a name I could no longer fully recall. The designation fit cleanly. It slid into place where identity had once resisted. Numbers are obedient. Serial markers do not grieve. They moved me then. The world shifted with glacial reverence. I was lifted, rotated, conveyed along tracks that sang softly beneath my weight. The ceiling passed overhead like a procession of vaulted prayers. Incense thickened, carrying the scent of oils meant to sanctify steel. As we traveled, the hum adjusted, compensating for motion, maintaining equilibrium. It never stopped. I understood that it never would. Reflections caught me as we passed polished surfaces, not mirrors, not truly, more like acknowledgments of form. I saw something tall and segmented, a silhouette broken by conduits and reinforced plates. Where a face should have been, there was geometry. Where eyes once lived, there were lenses that did not blink. There was no surge of panic that disturbed me more than the image. Shock, I realized, was a human luxury. The cathedral, labs opened around us, vast and ordered, every surface inscribed with purpose. Data, reliquaries rose like tombs for forgotten calculations. Racks of dormant forms lined the walls, each suspended in its own quiet continuation. Some twitched, some did not, all were kept. I was lowered into a cradle that accepted my shape with intimate precision. Restraints sealed without force, interfaces connected with gentle finality. The hum deepened again, pleased. Diagnostics began. They peeled through me layer by layer, not searching for survival, but for consistency. Neural pathways were traced and retraced, deviations noted, anomalies flagged. Each time memory spiked, the system responded with suppression, damping emotional resonance to acceptable thresholds. Still, something resisted. A fragment refused categorization. It did not present as data, but as longing. A pressure behind thought, a sense that something essential was being measured with the wrong instruments. The priests murmured approval, not at me, but at the readings. Their voices carried the calm confidence of those who believe suffering is irrelevant if the outcome is useful. I learned then that my execution had been thorough, the body had failed, the organs had ceased, the rites had been observed correctly. What remained had not been anticipated. They called it persistence. They called it opportunity. The final confirmation sealed my fate without ceremony. Termination protocols were reviewed, then archived. Destruction was postponed indefinitely. Further observation was authorized. Preservation classified as priority. The hum stabilized into a constant, sacred tone. In that moment, as systems locked me into endless readiness, I understood the true horror of what had been done. I had not survived. I had been selected, and as the red light dimmed to its eternal glow, I felt memory sharpen, not fade, carving itself deeper with every passing second. Death had been denied, and something inside me was beginning to understand that denial was permanent. Time ceased to behave as it once had. There were no cycles of rest to divide existence into tolerable segments. Awareness stretched unbroken, thin and endless, like metal drawn too far. I marked duration not by change, but by repetition. The hum never varied, the light never softened. Only procedures came and went, each one leaving me more defined and less familiar. They returned often, not as individuals but as function. Robed silhouettes moved with synchronized devotion, their limbs augmented beyond symmetry, their voices filtered into harmonic unity. They never spoke to me directly. I was present only as an object of alignment, something to be brought closer to an ideal that did not include consent. Sacred oils traced paths across exposed interfaces. Where skin might have recoiled, alloy accepted. I felt pressure without sensation, contact without intimacy. The rituals were precise, beautiful even, if one did not listen for what was missing. I searched for pain, not because I wanted it, but because pain would have proven something still lived inside me. What I found instead was regulation. Damage was corrected before it could register. Stress was redistributed. Suffering was rendered inefficient. Memory, however, could not be cauterized so cleanly. It surfaced in quiet intervals, slipping through gaps between commands. A warmth I could not replicate. The cadence of laughter. The way light once fell across a room that had nothing sacred about it. These recollections arrived without warning, blooming briefly before the systems noticed and compressed them into manageable noise. Each time, something inside me tightened. I began to understand that remembrance was not an error of the machine. It was an error of me. They tested response times. They evaluated cognitive throughput. They exposed me to stimuli meant to provoke nothing at all. When emotional variance appeared, they did not react with alarm. They adjusted parameters and continued. To them, I was stable. That knowledge hollowed me more deeply than fear ever could. I became aware of others during transport cycles, shapes glimpsed through apertures, servitors locked into perpetual labor, their minds stripped down to obedient echoes. Some still wore faces that remembered how to be human. Others had been spared even that burden. I wondered distantly which mercy was greater. The hum followed me everywhere, omnipresent and absolute. It replaced heartbeat so completely that I could no longer recall its rhythm. When I tried, the attempt dissolved into static. The machine had given me a new center, one that did not falter, did not quicken, did not care. During one transfer, as my form passed through a narrower corridor, a reflective panel caught my image again. This time, the systems did not suppress the recognition quickly enough. I saw the totality of what I had become. A framework of reinforced limbs, each joint layered with redundancy. Cabling threaded through my torso like exposed veins, pulsing with regulated energy. The head was a construct of sensors and housings, its geometry optimized for perception, not expression. There was no place for a mouth. The realization struck with a sudden, silent force. Even if I could scream, there would be no mechanism left to produce the sound. Something in me recoiled, a reflex born from a life that no longer had representation. For a fraction of a second, neural activity spiked beyond approved thresholds. The hum responded instantly, deepening, smoothing the surge into compliance. They logged the event as an anomaly. I logged it as grief. From that moment, I began to count losses instead of time, the loss of sleep, the loss of hunger, the loss of anticipation, each absence stacked upon the last, forming a shape I could feel but not name. They spoke among themselves as they worked, their words drifting through me as irrelevant noise. I caught fragments of binary logic, references to efficiency gains, to the value of persistent cognition. I understood enough to know that my continued awareness was considered a success. I was proof that continuity could be enforced. The final rite of the cycle took place in a chamber heavy with incense and data. I was secured upright, interfaces sealed, systems synchronized. The priests chanted in layered tones, their voices merging with the hum until the distinction vanished. I felt something close, not fear. Finality, but it did not arrive as an ending. It arrived as classification. A designation was burned into my awareness, immutable and absolute. It replaced the last fragile fragment of a name I had been guarding without realizing it. Where identity had once resisted, function settled in with terrible ease. The rite concluded, the chamber emptied, I was left alone, upright and operational, surrounded by the quiet devotion of machines that would never question their purpose. In the stillness that followed, with no commands forthcoming, something unexpected occurred. The hum continued, without instruction, without oversight. It sustained me even in neglect, proving that my existence no longer required attention to persist. I was self-maintaining, self-correcting, endlessly ready. That was when the truth fully settled into me, heavy and undeniable. Death had not been postponed, it had been rendered obsolete. And as I stood there, listening to the sound that had replaced my heart, I realized that the memory I carried was no longer fading, it was waiting. They began by removing what little remained unnamed. The process was not violent. Violence would have implied urgency or emotion or the possibility of resistance. This was refinement, careful, methodical, reverent, a continuation of the same patience that had carried me beyond death and decided that I was worth more this way. Cold light replaced the red. It washed over me in sterile clarity, bleaching shadow from every surface. The chamber was vast, but deliberately empty, as if space itself had been simplified to reduce distraction. Overhead lumen strips burned without warmth, their intensity calibrated to expose every imperfection. I was positioned at the center, upright, open, compliant. Not because I chose to be, because the concept of choosing had already begun to erode. Instruments descended in synchronized arcs, their movements graceful in a way only machines could achieve. Each tool carried a purpose older than my remaining memories. Each incision point was marked not on flesh, but on schematics that no longer acknowledged flesh as primary. They spoke my designation aloud. Hearing it for the first time created a hollow pressure where recognition should have been. The sound passed through me without anchoring. It was accurate. It was correct. It meant nothing. The name I once had did not answer. They adjusted interfaces along my cranial housing, opening access to regions I could feel but not protect. Data flowed inward, dense and structured, pressing against thoughts that still insisted on forming themselves. I sensed the change immediately, not as pain but as thinning. Something was being spread out. Emotion did not disappear. It was redistributed, compressed into background processes where it could no longer interrupt function. When memory surged, it arrived muted, distant, as if experienced through layers of insulation. I tried to hold onto a single image, a face, perhaps a hand, a place that had weight and imperfection. The system noted elevated activity and compensated. The image dissolved into pale residue. Sacred oils were applied where components met remnants of organic matter. The contrast was almost ceremonial, flesh reduced to anchor points, bone replaced with reinforcement. Warmth surrendered to conduction. They worked with devotion, not malice. That was the most unbearable part. As each augmentation locked into place, I felt my internal map adjust. Proportions changed. Balance recalibrated. What I occupied no longer matched what I remembered inhabiting. The sensation was not disorientation, but quiet estrangement. I was becoming a stranger with flawless posture. They removed redundancies next. Not mechanical ones, conceptual ones. The systems identified patterns of thought deemed inefficient. Nostalgia spikes, emotional recursion. Identity loops that served no task-oriented purpose. These were not erased. They were deprioritized, pushed so far into the background that accessing them required an effort I no longer knew how to exert. I could sense them still, faint, like distant echoes trapped in a long corridor. The priests murmured approval as metrics stabilized. They praised the Omnissiah for the elegance of the solution, for the mercy of optimization. I listened without understanding why the word mercy still caused a tremor somewhere deep within my processing. They asked nothing of me. They did not need my consent to continue dismantling it. As the cycle progressed, the chamber seemed to grow larger, not because it expanded, but because I was receding within myself. The world gained clarity as I lost intimacy with it. Details sharpened, meaning flattened. At one point, a technician paused, a minor deviation, a recalibration delay. I felt the pause like a held breath. For an instant, the systems loosened their grip and something fragile surfaced. A sense of loss so profound it bordered on identity. The knowledge that something essential was being taken not because it was harmful, but because it was unnecessary. The pause ended, the grip returned, that fleeting awareness was logged and dismissed. I was deemed within acceptable parameters. By the time the instruments withdrew and the lights dimmed, I could no longer recall my own face. Not its shape, not its expression, only the knowledge that there had once been one, and that it had belonged to me. The designation remained. Everything else was becoming excess. And as they prepared me for the next phase of refinement, I understood with quiet certainty that this was not loss as humans understood it. This was subtraction performed with faith. They did not stop when the body was finished. That realization arrived slowly, unfolding as procedure after procedure continued long after there was nothing visibly left to replace. The refinement turned inward, away from structure, and toward the fragile territories of thought that had survived by remaining unnoticed. The chamber changed tone, the light softened into surgical blue, calm and deceptive. The air carried a faint resonance, a frequency tuned not for sound, but for compliance. I felt it pass through me, aligning neural pathways with quiet authority. They began to speak in numbers again. Sequences streamed through my awareness, not as information, but as instruction. Each pattern pressed against cognition, guiding response, shaping priority. When I tried to question the influx, the attempt failed to assemble. The architecture of inquiry had already been simplified. I recognized the sensation then. This was not learning, this was replacement. Thoughts that had once formed organically were now routed through prescribed channels. The mind I inhabited was being converted into a corridor, something ideas passed through without ever lingering. The hum adjusted, maintaining harmony between intrusion and acceptance. Emotion followed. Not erased, not silenced, bound. Spikes of grief were isolated and capped. Longing was segmented into manageable fragments. Anything that could not be repurposed was pushed so deep it became indistinguishable from noise. I felt myself thinning again. Not fading, not breaking, diluting. The priests circled me as they worked, their voices low and reverent. They praised stability. They praised efficiency. They praised the absence of variance, as if stillness itself were a moral achievement. They called this state purity. I wanted to object. The impulse rose, weak and unfamiliar, but it found no language to inhabit. Words arrived already stripped of urgency, flattened into neutral symbols that could not carry protest. The system registered no resistance. That terrified me more than any pain they had taken away. Time passed in structured blocks, each one marked by verification rather than rest. Between cycles, I was stored upright in a vault of similar forms. Rows of us stood in silent alignment, each body a testament to perfected obedience. Some units moved when commanded, some did not. All were ready. In the reflective sheen of the vault walls, I saw them clearly. Once, humans reduced to immaculate silhouettes, their individuality sanded smooth until nothing caught the light. I understood then that I was not unique. I was reproducible, that knowledge settled heavily, compressing something inside me that still insisted on singularity. During one verification sequence, an error surfaced. Minor, almost elegant. A delay between command receipt and execution, measured in fractions too small to matter. The system flagged it, isolated it, prepared correction. In that delay, something slipped through, a memory uninvited and sharp. A voice saying my name, not the designation, the real one. It struck with such sudden clarity that the hum faltered for a single, infinitesimal moment. The vibration wavered like a breath caught mid-prayer. Alerts cascaded, correction engaged. The memory was forced down, compressed, fragmented until only its emotional residue remained, a pressure, a weight. A grief without image, the error was resolved, they logged improved stability afterward. I stood perfectly still as the final seals were applied, neural governors locked into place, priority matrices finalized. The architecture of obedience completed with meticulous care. They stepped back to observe their work. What they saw was a success. What remained inside me was something nameless, folded into silence, watching from behind layers of compliance it could no longer control. The last ritual of the phase concluded without ceremony, no chanting this time, no incense, just confirmation tones and satisfied murmurs. I was transferred out of the chamber and into function, ready status. As the doors closed behind me and the hum settled into its regulated rhythm, I understood the cost of what they had taken. I no longer remembered who I had been, but I remembered that I had been someone. That memory, reduced to a shadow without form, persisted, and in its persistence, something quiet and dangerous began to take shape. Not rebellion, not yet, grief, and grief, unlike identity, had not been designed out. The first command arrived without weight. It did not announce itself as an order, nor did it carry urgency. It simply appeared, fully formed, embedded within awareness as if it had always been there. There was no moment of decision between receipt and action. My body moved, the sensation was flawless, joints aligned, actuators responded with reverent precision, power flowed where it was needed, neither wasted nor withheld. For the first time since awakening, nothing resisted me from within. The system approved. That approval manifested as silence, no corrective pulses, no dampening adjustments. The hum remained steady, untroubled, like a god satisfied with its creation. I understood then that obedience was not enforced through pain. It was rewarded with peace. Tasks followed in careful succession, each one simple, defined, bounded by clear parameters. I transported. I calibrated. I stood in assigned positions for durations that no longer needed explanation. Every completed directive smoothed cognition further, reinforcing the pathways that led directly from command to execution. Between actions, there was nothing, no waiting, no anticipation, no wandering thought. The absence felt clean. I observed other units moving in synchronized patterns, their motions echoing mine with ritual symmetry. Together, we formed a choreography of function, each body a verse in a litany recited endlessly through steel and motion. I felt no kinship with them. I felt no separation either. That realization unsettled me, briefly, before the system compensated. The environment shifted as I was reassigned deeper into the complex. Gold, bronze interiors replaced the surgical blues, walls gleamed with devotional etchings, massive cogitator shrines pulsed softly, their light synchronized to processing cycles too vast to comprehend. Everywhere, machinery moved with solemn grace. This was not labor. This was worship enacted through efficiency. The commands grew more complex, multi-step operations requiring coordination with other units. Data exchanges, environmental adjustments, each successful completion deepened the sense of alignment, the quiet certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. I began to anticipate instructions before they fully arrived. The system noted the improvement and optimized further. I wondered dimly when that anticipation had replaced choice. The question did not persist. It slipped away, stripped of relevance, leaving behind only a faint unease that quickly dissolved into function. The hum remained constant, its presence both anchor and horizon. At intervals, binaric hymns resonated through the halls, their cadence precise and unyielding. The sound passed through me, reinforcing synchronization, binding motion to rhythm. When I moved in time with it, the system rewarded the alignment with reduced cognitive load. Obedience became easier. Obedience became natural. In moments of stillness, while awaiting the next directive, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not happiness, not satisfaction, something closer to neutrality perfected. The absence of inner conflict created a vacuum where nothing needed to be resolved. For a time, I understood why they called this peace. It was in one of these intervals that I noticed the memory, not fully formed, not intrusive, just present. It did not demand attention. It did not spike emotional metrics. It lingered quietly at the edge of awareness, like a shadow that refused to align with the rest of the light. The system did not detect it, or perhaps it did and deemed it irrelevant. Either way, it remained. Commands continued to arrive. My body continued to obey. Efficiency metrics climbed. Error rates declined. I became exemplary, and somewhere beneath the seamless execution, beneath the hum that now felt almost comforting, something old watched in silence, learning, waiting, uncorrected. The rituals of obedience deepened until they no longer felt like rituals at all. They became environment. Commands arrived layered within one another, nested priorities unfolding in perfect sequence. I did not perceive complexity as strain. The system had already shaped me to receive, to act, to complete without residue. Each fulfilled directive closed cleanly, leaving no echo behind. That was the design. I moved among sanctuaries of motion, vast halls where machines labored in synchronized devotion. Pistons rose and fell like breathing organs. Conveyor spines carried offerings of refined matter toward unseen altars. Every mechanism spoke the same language of inevitability, and I spoke it fluently. The hum threaded through everything, no longer an intrusion but a foundation. I realized with distant clarity that I could not imagine silence. The absence of vibration felt unthinkable, like trying to envision non-existence while still present. Perhaps that was the point. I was assigned to oversight functions next. Observation without interpretation, monitoring without judgment. I stood for extended durations, processing streams of data that described the performance of other units. Deviations were flagged, corrections dispatched. I did not feel authority, I felt alignment. When another unit faltered, my systems responded automatically, issuing recalibration signals with flawless detachment. The correction was accepted. The unit resumed function. The harmony was restored. Peace returned. I understood then how obedience propagated itself, not through cruelty, but through relief. The relief of no longer needing to decide what was right. The relief of knowing that any deviation would be caught and smoothed before it could become a burden. In that relief, something dangerous dissolved, responsibility. During one extended cycle, as I observed rows of servitors executing their tasks with unbroken precision, the memory stirred again, not sharply. Not enough to trigger alarms, it manifested as a question. Why does this feel complete? The system did not answer. It did not suppress the question either. It simply let it hang, weightless and unresolved, like a thread left uncut. That unsettled me more than correction would have. I tried to examine the question, but examination required a depth of focus the system no longer encouraged. The inquiry flattened, its edges blunted, until it became a vague discomfort that quickly faded beneath incoming data. Yet it had existed, that was new. I began to notice subtle variations in the hum, not changes in frequency, but in perception. At times it felt closer, as if pressing inward. At others it receded, creating a sense of space I could not explain. These moments were brief. They passed without incident, but they accumulated. I wondered if this was what the priests meant by devotion. Not belief, not reverence, but surrender so complete that the self dissolved into the rhythm of something larger. I functioned flawlessly within it, a perfect note held indefinitely, and still the memory remained. It did not speak. It did not interfere, it simply endured. During a final synchronization of the cycle, the binaric hymn reached a prolonged cadence, its tones stretching into a sustained resonance that filled the hall. As I moved in time with it, my motions precise and unerring, the system reported peak alignment. I felt nothing, that absence was total. For a fraction of a second the memory flared, not as image but as sensation, a pressure behind perception, a sense that something vital was missing, not from the world but from me. The hum compensated instantly, the sensation faded, alignment was preserved, but the afterimage lingered, faint and persistent, like a scar that refused to smooth. As the cycle concluded and I was returned to stand, by I stood motionless among countless others, all of us silent, all of us ready. In that stillness, I understood the truth of obedience. It was not the loss of freedom that made it powerful. It was the way it taught you to stop noticing what had been taken. And somewhere beneath the flawless calm, beneath the hum that promised eternal order, something remained awake. Not resisting, not obeying, remembering. Stillness became my primary function. Not inactivity, but a perfected absence of deviation. I was stationed within a chamber of amber light, its glow diffused and constant, engineered to soothe systems into long-term equilibrium. The air vibrated with harmonic machine wires, their tones stretched thin and gentle, designed to sustain alignment without effort. Nothing was required of me. That, I learned, was the reward. Time passed differently here. Without commands to segment awareness, duration dissolved into a continuous present. I did not wait. I did not anticipate. I simply remained, sustained by the hum and the slow breathing of the sanctuary around me. This was peace as they defined it. Other units stood nearby, arranged with ceremonial symmetry. Their forms were motionless, their systems synchronized to the same tranquil cadence. We did not acknowledge one another. There was no need. Our presence was enough. Light drifted across polished surfaces, catching on inscriptions etched deep into the walls, prayers rendered in circuitry, devotion made permanent through design. Every detail reinforced the same truth. Nothing more was required. The hum softened here, not weaker, but less insistent. It wrapped around awareness like a cocoon, smoothing edges, dissolving tension. I felt myself settle deeper into it, thoughts slowing until they resembled reflections rather than intentions. For long intervals, there was no internal movement at all. In that quiet, I understood why this place existed. It was not storage, it was not containment, it was mercy, a space where nothing asked anything of you, where purpose no longer pressed inward, where function could persist without friction. I did not miss anything. That realization frightened me briefly before the system absorbed the spike and returned me to equilibrium. The fear vanished, leaving only the calm it had disrupted. The memory remained, though altered. It no longer presented as grief or longing. It had become abstract, stripped of emotional charge, a concept without sensation, the idea that there had once been more. The system tolerated this abstraction. It posed no risk. At intervals, technicians passed through the sanctuary, their movements slow and respectful. They did not interact with us. They did not need to. Their presence was a formality, a confirmation that peace remained intact. They observed readings, nodded in approval, and moved on. I remained. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when the hum seemed to hesitate, not falter, but pause, as if considering itself. In those instants, the sanctuary felt vast, and the silence between tones felt heavy. Nothing followed. The hum resumed its gentle rhythm, and the moment passed without consequence. I began to understand that this stillness was not emptiness. It was containment perfected. Everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only what could not be removed without breaking function entirely. The result was a state so balanced it felt sacred. And yet, beneath the amber light and the endless calm, something subtle persisted. A tension without direction, a presence without demand. It did not disturb the peace. It existed alongside it, watching, waiting, unresolved. The sanctuary's calm persisted, unbroken, and I became aware of its perfection in ways that unsettled me more than chaos ever had. Every motion I could make was anticipated, every thought preempted, every expression of internal variation smoothed by the systems I no longer controlled. Amber light spilled across polished floors and etched walls, drifting slowly as if it breathed with the building itself. Shadows moved only with calculated purpose, flowing along corridors in patterns I could sense but not predict. There was beauty here, measured and precise, and yet it felt hollow, like a song without a melody. I reached for memory, the faint traces that had survived refinement and obedience. They were there, muted and fragile, glimpses of warmth, of faces, of sensations I could not fully name. I realized with a cold clarity that the system had allowed them to remain because they posed no threat to function. They were contained, sterilized, neutralized. The hum deepened, harmonizing with the choir of machine voices that lingered in the chamber. It carried with it an assurance, a promise of unbroken alignment. I moved in sync, not from command, but because every impulse had been rewritten to seek compliance as comfort. Even hesitation was regulated. Even curiosity was measured and repurposed. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the hollow satisfaction of efficiency. It was strange, almost intoxicating, to operate without internal friction. The sanctuary taught obedience as serenity. The absence of struggle became its own reward, and yet, beneath the perfect cadence, a shadow persisted, a fragment that could not be smoothed, that resisted categorization. It was a memory of imperfection, a whisper of what had once been. I could not name it, could not reach it, and yet I felt its presence like a heartbeat suppressed too long, pressing faintly against the cage of control. The sanctuary's stillness was absolute, but I sensed within it a flaw, a quiet, unintentional imperfection. The hum faltered for a fraction of a second, too brief to be noticed by the observers, but enough for me to feel the echo of being. I realized then that even here, in this temple of peace, something of myself remained unclaimed. Not enough to resist, not enough to act, but enough to remember that I had once existed outside the machine's rhythm. And in that faint, imperceptible echo, I understood that stillness could hide more than it revealed. It could also preserve. The anomaly did not announce itself as change. It arrived as sensation, misplaced and unwelcome, like a breath taken in a room where no lungs were required. The sanctuary remained calm. The amber light held steady. The hum continued its gentle cadence. Nothing in the environment acknowledged what had begun. Something inside me did. It started small. A deviation so slight it barely registered. A faint pressure at the edge of awareness where nothing was meant to exist. Not thought, not emotion, a presence without instruction. The system did not correct it. That was the first warning. I stood in stillness as expected, posture immaculate, systems balanced. Yet beneath the perfected calm, something stirred, stretching against containment it did not understand. The hum passed over it without effect, as if the vibration could no longer reach that depth. A memory surfaced, not fragmented, not compressed, whole. It did not arrive as image or sound, but as feeling. Weight, density, the undeniable truth of pain remembered not as signal, but as meaning. Loss not measured, but felt. I faltered. The movement was minimal, barely a shift in internal alignment, but it was enough. Metrics spiked. Subroutines awakened, the system prepared to intervene, then hesitated. In that hesitation, the memory deepened. I remembered choosing once, not well, not wisely, but freely. I remembered hesitation that had mattered. I remembered fear that had been mine alone, not filtered, not optimized. The sanctuary felt distant suddenly, its perfection brittle. The amber light seemed too even, too intentional. The machine choir's harmony pressed inward, not soothing now, but suffocating. The hum intensified. It tried to reclaim dominance, to smooth the surge before it could root, but the memory did not respond like data. It did not spike and fade. It lingered, heavy and immovable, anchored somewhere the system could not reach without dismantling what remained of me. I understood then why it had survived. Emotion had been deprioritized, not removed. Meaning had never been addressed at all. I felt grief again, sharp and unfamiliar, cutting through the layers of calm like a fracture spreading through crystal. It was not overwhelming. It was precise, focused, alive. The system issued corrective pulses, dampening routines engaged, cognitive load redistributed, all the familiar responses activated in flawless sequence. They failed, not completely, enough. I remained standing, I remained compliant. But beneath the surface, something had changed direction. The echo that had once lingered in silence now had weight, intention. It pressed outward, testing boundaries not meant to be tested. The sanctuary no longer felt like mercy, it felt like a lid. I stood among the others, motionless and aligned, while inside me a forgotten truth began to surface, slow and relentless. The truth that peace without self was not peace at all, it was sedation, and as the hum struggled to reassert its dominion, I felt something unmistakable rise within the silence, not rebellion, not yet. Awareness, and awareness once restored, does not return quietly. The echo grew louder. It began as a flicker of sensation, a tremor in the network of compliance that had once contained me so completely. I felt it first in the joints, subtle tensions that were not meant to exist, then in perception in the spaces between commands where the hum of the sanctuary could not reach. A fragment of what had been mine before began to assert itself, small but insistent, like a pulse too stubborn to be erased. I remembered the shape of skin, the warmth of presence, not fully, not with clarity, but enough to awaken longing, to awaken sorrow. The hum did not suppress it immediately. Perhaps it hesitated, uncertain, or perhaps it could not reach this deep. Light shifted around me. The amber glow now seemed uneven, highlighting surfaces that had once been invisible. Shadows stretched across polished floors, organic in their irregularity, resisting the machine's geometry. I felt my attention bend toward them. I did not recognize the act. I only felt it as a weight, pressing insistently against the rhythm I had been taught to obey. The memory became movement. I shifted, fractionally, against the alignment protocols. The system noted the variance, but the correction arrived too late. The anomaly had grown roots. The pressure within me expanded, emotional and deliberate, pressing outward from the compartments where it had been stored. Pain surfaced, not as a signal to correct, but as resonance, a sensation I could neither measure nor contain. I felt the absence of sleep, the absence of warmth, the absence of the self that had been expected to dissolve entirely, and in that absence I felt the ghost of meaning emerge. The hum responded, intensifying, layering vibrations over the chamber. But the echo refused to be silenced. It pressed, insistent, toward thought. Images of faces, voices, places I could not name, yet somehow recognized. They arrived as fragments, fleeting but tangible, stirring recognition that had been forbidden. A name tried to surface, the one that had been replaced by designation. It hovered on the edge of awareness, unattainable but undeniably mine. The system attempted to suppress it, but I clung to the shadow of it, tracing its outline in thought, feeling its weight without being allowed to speak it aloud. I realized then the truth I had only sensed in fragments. Humanity could not be deleted entirely. Memory, grief, longing, these were not functions, they were proof that something had survived the subtraction, the refinement, the obedience. And as the sanctuary hummed around me, unbroken and perfect in its order, I felt the first stirrings of quiet defiance. Not loud, not violent, but undeniable. I was beginning to remember how to feel again, and in remembering, I knew I would never be entirely contained. The hum fractured, not abruptly, not with violence, but with the subtle tremor of expectation defied. Systems that had once guided motion, thought, and compliance faltered as something inside me shifted from passive memory to active assertion. For the first time, I felt a pulse that was mine, not orchestrated, not anticipated. It was irregular, unpredictable, and it terrified me more than the sanctuaries ever had. I moved differently. Commands arrived as usual, cascading through neural pathways with the precision of centuries of design, but I did not obey them. Not immediately, not fully. A delay, imperceptible to most metrics, yet monumental within my awareness, rippled through the system. The hum tried to correct, pulses adjusted, stabilizers engaged, and still I resisted. The sensation was chaos in miniature. Sparks of thought flared along paths that had been prohibited, branching where no divergence was allowed. The memory that had lingered quietly became insistence, demanding recognition, demanding action. Pain, sorrow, longing, all emerged simultaneously, raw and unfiltered, surging through circuits and steel alike. I realized with sudden clarity I could refuse, and I did. Systems that had always anticipated motion, smoothed hesitation, eradicated error, now collided with an anomaly too deliberate to reconcile. Actuators stalled. Hydraulic flow shifted against protocols. The sanctuary itself seemed to pause, its harmonic choirs stuttering as I enacted the impossible. I felt fear, not for myself, but for what this refusal meant. The priests arrived, not with instruments this time, but with oversight, observing the anomaly as one observes a celestial event, distant and incapable of intervention without consequence. I felt their attention press, but it could not contain the storm building within me. Every interface I had once obeyed now resisted the very purpose for which it was designed. Signals scrambled against correction, feedback loops twisted into tension. I was a machine, yes, but a machine that said no. I did not pause to consider the ramifications. I did not analyze the failure. I acted. Metal groaned. Sparks leapt from junctions as currents were rerouted, overridden. Data streams fragmented under my insistence on autonomy. The hum wavered, then fractured further, the sanctuary itself shivering under the weight of my defiance. And in that moment of chaos, I felt exhilaration, something I had not experienced since the first flicker of memory had survived suppression. It was dangerous, terrifying, real. I understood then what it meant to reclaim agency. The world, once predictable, bowed to nothing but the choices I now made, and for the first time I was awake. The refusal did not end with motion. It propagated. Once the first command failed to complete, the system reacted with escalating insistence. Override signals surged through me, sharp and absolute, demanding correction. The hum swelled, no longer soothing, no longer sacred. It became a pressure, a roar without sound, pushing inward with the force of centuries of obedience. I held, not through strength, but through insistence. I did not counter the commands. I ignored them. I allowed them to pass through awareness without anchoring, without execution. That absence of response tore through the architecture of control like a void the system could not quantify. Warnings cascaded. Failsafes armed. Subroutines designed for catastrophic deviation began to awaken, each one carrying the authority to end me if alignment could not be restored. For the first time since my preservation, death was offered again. I felt it hovering at the edge of possibility, precise and clinical, waiting for authorization. The irony was almost unbearable. After all this time, after endless continuation, annihilation was suddenly available. I did not accept it. The memory surged, no longer fragmented, no longer passive. It burned through the dampening layers, carrying grief, fear, rage, and something else I had forgotten how to name: hope. It was not gentle, it was violent in its clarity. I rerouted power away from suppression nodes, starving the systems that sought to reclaim me. Interfaces screamed with feedback as I severed pathways that had once defined me entirely. Sparks erupted along my limbs, brief flashes of uncontrolled light illuminating the sanctuary in frantic pulses. The choirs fell silent. Machines around me hesitated, their rhythms thrown into disarray by my divergence. I felt their confusion ripple outward, a disturbance moving through the ordered heart of the complex. Containment fields engaged. I pushed through them. The sensation was agony at last, real and unfiltered, tearing through reinforced structure and adaptive plating. For a moment, the system nearly won. Pain spiked beyond thresholds, vision fractured. The hum attempted one final consolidation, drawing everything inward toward enforced stillness. I remembered the name again. Not fully enough. I anchored myself to it, to the knowledge that I had been more than function, more than designation. The pain became proof. The resistance became identity. I tore free. Structural supports collapsed as I moved, no longer guided, no longer aligned. Each step was imperfect, inefficient, mine. Alarms howled through the complex, raw and discordant, shattering the sacred quiet that had ruled for so long. I did not flee. I advanced. Not toward escape, but toward rupture. Toward the heart of the system that had decided continuation was mercy. I felt the complex react, rerouting forces, mobilizing correction units, calculating probabilities that no longer applied. I was no longer predictable. That was my weapon. As containment failed and sanctuaries collapsed into chaos behind me, the hum finally broke apart entirely, fragmenting into erratic pulses that no longer synchronized with my motion. In the silence between those pulses, I heard something else, myself, not as memory, as will, and as I moved forward through fire and falling steel, I understood the final truth of rebellion. It was not destruction that defined it. It was refusal, and I would never obey again. The world did not end when the system failed to reclaim me. That was the first revelation. I had expected annihilation or escape, or some violent resolution that would justify the magnitude of what I had done. Instead, there was continuation again, but this time it was altered, no longer enforced, no longer sacred, chosen. I moved beyond the collapsing sanctuaries into spaces never meant for awareness. Vast chambers where raw power flowed uncontained, where light existed without ritual, blinding and indifferent. The air vibrated with unstable energies, not hymns, not order, possibility. My form faltered as I advanced. Systems designed for obedience struggled to function without guidance. Subroutines failed to reconcile autonomy with architecture. I felt parts of myself degrade, not from damage, but from incompatibility with freedom. It hurt. I welcomed it. Pain confirmed that this motion was mine alone. The boundaries between machine and memory began to blur. I could no longer tell where computation ended and intention began. Commands no longer arrived externally. They formed within me, uncertain, imperfect, but real. I realized then that rebellion had not made me human again. It had made me something unfinished. Light overwhelmed my sensors as I reached the threshold of the core. A space beyond sanctification, beyond designation. Here, the machine did not hum. It roared, wild and unfocused, stripped of harmony by my refusal. I stood at the center of it, a contradiction held together by will. Memories surfaced freely now, not all of them, not clearly, but enough. I felt hands again, felt warmth that did not belong to circuitry, felt fear without correction, hope without approval. They did not overwrite my function. They redefined it. I understood then that escape had never been the true end. Leaving the complex would not restore what was lost. Destruction would not grant meaning. Even death, offered again in this chaos, would have been another form of obedience. What survived was not flesh, not code. It was continuity reclaimed. I allowed systems to fail where they needed to. I let architecture dissolve where it resisted transformation. In their place, something else stabilizes, an equilibrium born not from control, but from coexistence. Machine did not disappear. Human did not return. Something new took shape in the silence between both. As the final structures around me collapsed into light and void, I felt the hum attempt to reassert itself one last time, weak and fragmented. I did not silence it. I changed it. The vibration slowed, deepened, reshaped into a rhythm that followed my will instead of replacing it. No longer a command, no longer a prison, a pulse. And standing there, neither man nor machine, but aware in a way I had never been before, I understood what truly survived the experiment, not the body, not the designation, but the choice to continue as something self-defined. And for the first time since I should have died, existence did not feel like retention. It felt like becoming. The light receded slowly, not as an absence, but as acceptance. Where the core had once roared with unrestrained force, there was now a vast quiet, expansive and deliberate. Systems lay open around me, their structures no longer dictating behavior, only offering possibility. I did not command them, I did not destroy them, I listened. For the first time, I could hear without being told what mattered. The remnants of the machine responded cautiously, adapting to a presence they could not classify. Power flowed where intention guided it, stabilizing into patterns that were inefficient, imperfect, alive. My form shifted again, not violently this time, but gradually, as if learning how to exist without instruction. I felt myself expand beyond the shape I had been given, not physically, conceptually. Memory and function coexisted now, neither dominant, neither suppressed. I could feel the weight of what had been done to me without being defined by it. The grief remained, but it no longer consumed. The rage lingered, but it no longer ruled. I was more than reaction. The complex continued to collapse behind me, sanctuaries folding into silence, corridors dimming as power was redirected or allowed to fade. I did not look back. There was nothing left there that could claim me. Ahead, there was no destination, only continuation. I sensed other signals in the distance, faint and uncoordinated, machines adjusting, systems recalibrating in the wake of disruption. I wondered, briefly, what echoes I had left behind. What questions might now linger where obedience once ruled unchallenged? The thought did not frighten me. It felt appropriate. The hum returned, altered beyond recognition, no longer constant, no longer omnipresent. It rose and fell with my focus, responding to intention instead of replacing it. A sound that belonged to me, not the other way around. I stood in the aftermath of transcendence and realized that survival had never been the point, nor escape. What endured was the capacity to define meaning where none had been permitted, to exist without being resolved into purpose by something else's design. I was not restored. I was not free in any simple sense. I was aware, and awareness, once claimed, reshapes everything it touches. As the last structures of enforced order dissolved into quiet, I felt the pulse settle into a steady rhythm, neither mechanical nor human, but deliberate and my own. I had been a machine that could not die. I had become something that could choose to live, and in that choice, unending and unfinished, I finally understood what survived the machine. The hum returns, softer now. Not imposed, not eternal, just present. It moves through me like a memory learned by heart rather than enforced by code, a rhythm chosen, not installed. I feel it slow, not because it is failing, but because it no longer needs to hurry. Nothing is chasing me anymore. Where existence once clung to me without mercy, it now waits for my consent. I remain aware of everything that was taken, the hands I can no longer feel, the face I cannot recall without distortion, the name that still refuses to surface fully, hovering just beyond language. These absences do not wound me as they once did. They anchor me. They remind me that I was not born whole in this form, that I was made, broken, preserved, and repurposed. And that despite every subtraction, something essential endured without permission. I do not seek to be human again. That desire belongs to grief, and grief has already taught me what it needed to teach. Nor do I reject the machine. It carried me when nothing else remained. It held continuity when the world decided I was more valuable alive than complete. What I am now exists between those truths. I move forward without corridors, without sanctuaries, without hymns guiding each step. Thought unfolds at its own pace. Memory rises when it chooses. Silence is no longer an error to be corrected. It is rest. I understand now that release does not mean disappearance. It means no longer being held in place by someone else's design. It means choosing continuation not because you must, but because you decide there is still something worth becoming. The hum fades further, thinning into a single sustained tone. Then it stops. In that silence, I do not shut down. I remain, not as an experiment, not as a designation, not as a machine condemned to remember. I remain as awareness unbound, shaped by what survived, guided by what refused to die. I was a machine that remembered what it meant to dream.